Right. Well, I'm going to hand over to Paul for the not easy task of drawing out some of the key points and giving us some more food for thought.
Okay. Sort of 5-10 minutes, really.
Yeah, 10,
Okay.
15 even.
Well, thank you both. They're both sort of very much sort of 100-mile-an-hour plus presentations. So I'll try and be slower and sort of catch my breath slightly. And maybe yours too. The report, the ActionAid report, in the introduction talks about the impression of being the humanitarian actors being bogged down with process, and focused on the sort of mechanics of aid delivery at to some extent the expense of principles, and I think both presentations sort of highlighted that, and I mean it's also worth I think saying that this resonates very much with other contexts. This isn't a peculiarly Pakistan problem. Certainly in Sri Lanka, in recent years, very similar challenges have been faced by international humanitarian actors. Somalia at the moment, there are very sort of serious concerns over the extent to which aid is being impartial or not, and donors trying to direct aid to PNG-controlled areas at neglect of others. So this is the question of sort of where we're currently at in terms of respect for humanitarian principles on the part of both donor governments and disaster-affected governments is an important issue. Always has been, but it's particularly important at this point in time. And the ActionAid report also does make the point that this is not a new problem. You know, the issues we're grappling with here are sort of the sort of fundamental challenges of international humanitarian action to some extent. They've always been there, and you know, from Biafra to conflicts throughout the past few decades. It's not necessarily that this is new, but it's always been difficult. And as well as resonating with other current contexts, it's also sort of consistent with findings more. The relative neglect of how to be principled was something we also came across in our review of the sort of state of the humanitarian system that we did for ALNAP, looking globally and across different contexts at humanitarian action. The perception of people engaged in humanitarian aid with international agencies was that, in a performance sense, in a sort of how well are we doing in ensuring respect for principles, both on the part of our own organisations and in advocating for respect for humanitarian principles with governments. The sort of perception of aid workers was that the system isn't doing very well at doing that, that it's probably one of its biggest weaknesses. So I think, we're right to highlight these problems, and they're not just in relation to Pakistan. A question listening to both the presentations was whether the issue of principles is just a matter of sort of better communication. Agencies are principled, and if only they could communicate this better to disaster-affected populations, people would understand that they're principled. Or whether there's a more fundamental problem that organisations' principles have been compromised, and that the stabilisation agenda, the politicisation of aid, very deliberately on the part of some of the donor governments, means that aid isn't principled in Pakistan, and the perception of beneficiaries that it's not is perfectly correct, and where that lies and what you can do about it. The problems that Samir is highlighting with the role that the UN played, its focus on the One UN process, its desire to maintain good relations with the government, and what that meant for how it engaged with humanitarian action. And I guess related to that, there's a sort of question in my mind around sort of the so what question. I think of it as there's been a long history in sort of the humanitarian literature of I think of it as bleating, of complaining about the lack of respect for principles on the part of different actors, and and lamenting the fact that there's a shrinking humanitarian space, or that nasty donors aren't being principled enough, or nasty governments aren't being principled enough, without asking, so what can you do about it? What can we as international humanitarian agencies wanting to try and deliver assistance and protection in a given context do about sort of maintaining and advocating for respect for principles? And linked to that, I think also, Samir talked about it right at the end, the extent to which you can or can't step out of the system. If some organisations feel that some of the humanitarian system isn't principled, can they step out of it and maintain and defend principled action in a sort of narrow sphere, or not? And the sort of extent to which you can swim against the tide is I think, a difficult question. And then I guess there's a set of questions around that both presentations talked about the sort of the process of engagement with the state and with government in a context like Pakistan, where, as Samir elucidated, there are very clear reasons why the Pakistani government wants to control and influence international humanitarian action. For them, aid is part of a military and political agenda, and faced with an assertive state with its own political motives, how aid agencies can better navigate principled engagement with that government is sort of, I think, at the core of what we should be discussing here. And there are clear failures in the process that's been described in how well the system did that, both at the sort of leadership level with the humanitarian coordinator, Samir talked about the basic operating roles, but the fact that these weren't taken up or followed through, the failure to keep to red lines even when they had been discussed, the failure to have any sort of collective solidarity across organisations, and the lack of investment in advocacy around sort of principled engagement with government. So the so what question, I think, is partly there are things that collectively and individually organisations could have been doing in Pakistan and weren't well enough. It's not just that it's an impossible problem; it's that there is a list of sort of actions that could have been done better. So the question is, in a sense, why isn't that happening, and what could be done to ensure that it is being done better? Which isn't to acknowledge that it isn't very difficult. For all sorts of reasons. If you're an individual, if you're the SAVE or the Oxfam or the CARE country director in Pakistan, the extent to which you can influence the need to sort of do better in relation to advocating for humanitarian principles is very hard. Samir talked briefly about one of the fundamental humanitarian principles around neutrality is not taking sides in a conflict. And that implies the ability to talk to both sides, but in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan, that's been made almost impossible, particularly if you receive any US government funding. And there are interesting discussions going on sort of within organisations receiving US funding about the question of whether or not they could be prosecuted for talking to terrorist-listed organisations in contexts like Pakistan and Sudan. So, as country director X, it's not just whether you can or not, it's whether if you did, you'd be sent to jail. And so there are very sort of real personal as well as sort of organisational challenges in what should be a fairly fundamental part of principled humanitarian action. I was going to wrap up there. There's also all sorts of other things that were mentioned in the first presentation around the appropriateness of assistance and the relative neglect of different ways in, host families and people, the continuing blindness of the international humanitarian action to people who don't go neatly into camps, and that certainly again resonates with our context and is not unique to Pakistan as a failure. But I think that the sort of fundamental issues that would be good to discuss here are around the ones I've just been talking around principles and the extent to which agencies individually and collectively could do better, or whether it's just a sort of impossible set of challenges in a very difficult operating environment where it's all very well, for instance, to say that you should be following more of an exception security strategy, but as the individual security officer responsible for trying to ensure that staff aren't kidnapped or killed, taking down the walls would be very difficult to do. And so, it's very easy to sit here and say you should have less security, and much harder to do that if you're sitting in Pakistan. And so you need to guard against the sort of easy criticism in some sense of agencies working in what are fantastically difficult operating environments. So it'd be interesting to get your views on the extent to which the criticism is sort of fair and valid, and what more could be done about ensuring more principled humanitarian action, and the extent to which these just represent impossibly difficult operating environments where there are definite limits to what can be achieved in a real politic world.
Thanks very much, Paul.